The water boiled long before the man screamed, bubbled with the thick hunger of law. Not mercied swirl a sermon, each hiss a hymn. Steam curled into the sky like incense, sanctified by blood, by fire, by a king's unsigned regret. The cauldron stood at Smithfield, tall and wide as a cradle of wrath, the iron belly of England's fury. Inside, the cook's body began to change slowly, tenderly, as if the fire took its time, savoring each layer. His skin cracked first, then bubbled, then slid. The fingers that once knew the texture of veal, the salt of brine, and the art of flame now curled like dry twigs left too long in a dying hearth. They did not look human anymore. They looked like warnings, and yet the crowd did not flinch. They did not shield their eyes or weep into sleeves. No, they leaned forward. They inhaled. Hunger is not always for food. Sometimes it is for spectacle. Sometimes it is for righteousness so sharp it cuts the flesh from a man's bones. A priest turned his head, muttering Latin not to save the soul, but to save his own stomach from revolt. A butcher wept not from pity, but from memory. That smell, that thick and fatty scent, reminded him of brisket, of market days, of things he could not afford to feel anymore. And at the edge of it all stood the king, not cruel, not mournful, simply watching. His eyes did not water, his hands did not tremble. For this, he claimed, was not murder. It was doctrine. The cook had committed no treason. He had raised no army, seduced no queen, stolen no coin. His crime was older, more sacred. He had fed meat to Christians on a Friday, a day when flesh was forbidden. A day marked by fasting, not feasting. The law had been silent before, but now it screamed from the mouths of judges and clergymen. Parliament did not debate, it obeyed. And so a man was sentenced not to death, but to boiling his flesh rendered into vapors, his bones into broth, so that England would remember what happens when appetite defies the altar. There is a special cruelty in making a cook suffer by fire. It is not just punishment. It is irony, a reversal. The man who once orchestrated flavors is now reduced to one. The smell of cooked flesh. They say he howled. They say he begged. They say he cursed the king, the bishop, the silence of God. But no words remain, only the scent. It lingered long after the fire died, settling into the stones, soaking into the robes of onlookers, turning the marketplace into a mausoleum. What is the meaning of such a death? What do we worship when we kill, not for power, but for piety? Perhaps that is the true horror, that this was not vengeance. This was not rage. This was not madness. It was order. A man died not because Henry VIII hated him, but because Henry needed the world to know that divine law now wore a crown. This was the new faith, not Roman, not papal, English, regal, and it demanded offerings. When faith becomes law, the people whispered, even hunger can be heresy. And so the cook burned, not in secret, not in shame, but in front of a crowd, in front of his God, in front of a king. And as the steam rose, as the marrow melted, as the final screams dissolved into silence, Cain learned a lesson far more frightening than death. It learned that there are moments when even food can kill you. It's moments when the line between sinner and supper disappears. Moments when a kingdom feeds itself not with bread, but with belief. And on such days, you do not eat to survive. You starve to obey. Before he was meat, he was music. Not in voice or verse, but in hands, swift, clean, blessed with a kind of grace that turned broth into balm. Richard Roose was not a nobleman. He did not sign decrees or ride into battle, but his fingers fed. the ones who did. In the kitchens of Lambeth Palace, beneath the vaulted shadows of church and court, he was known not by title, but by scent rosemary, wine vinegar, cloves steeped in lamb fat. He was trusted, he was needed, and for a time he was invisible enough to be safe. They say the Archbishop of Canterbury smiled when Roose was near, a rare honor. For what is politics without the illusion of warmth, and what is warmth without supper? Richard understood this. His art was not just in flavor, it was in timing, in silence, in knowing when to serve and when to vanish. He fed the powerful, but never interrupted them. That was the rule. A cook's hands may touch the highest tables, but his voice never rises above the lowest servant. That too is a kind of power, and Richard wore it like a second skin. He was not ambitious. He did not seek favor, but he was good. Too good. A world ruled by suspicion. Sometimes competence is the loudest threat. He moved through corridors lined with robes and secrets, catching glimpses of bishops arguing over doctrine, hearing whispers of Henry's latest marriage debate, feeling the heat not just of ovens, but of reform. The church was splitting, Rome was breaking, and in the middle of it all, Richard stirred his pots, steady and loyal, like a heartbeat ignored until it stops. No one feared him, no one envied him. That was the tragedy. His meals were gentle, filled with the kind of comfort that made even cruel men quiet for a moment. The bread soaked in wine, ox cheek with marrow, pies so rich they hushed entire rooms. He knew hunger not as emptiness, but as emotion, and he filled it with care. So how does a man like that end in a cauldron? What sign hides in skill? What flaw is carved in loyalty? Maybe it was not what Richard did, but what he symbolized. A servant close to the sacred. A commoner whose hand shaped the private lives of priests. When the world begins to burn, it is often the bystanders who are first offered to the flame. They burn easiest. They are soft. They are flammable. And when power needs to prove its reach, it reaches downward. Perhaps Richard did nothing wrong. Perhaps he was simply nearby when a nobleman felt ill, or when a dish smelled too strong on the wrong day, or when a whisper turned into a verdict. In the Tudor world, one did not need to betray to be punished. Proximity was enough. Position was guilt. And Richard, he was perfectly placed. They say he laughed often, that he fed stray dogs behind the kitchens, that he saved the softest cuts for the older servants whose teeth had long surrendered, that he once gave a starving child a biscuit meant for the bishop's guest. Small acts, forgotten kindnesses, but fire does not discriminate between cruelty and grace. It consumes what it is told. Richard Roose had no lineage, no army, no shield, but his apron. But for a time, he had a place, a purpose, and in the alchemy of Tudor politics, that was almost sacred. Before the screams, before the sentence, before the salt turned bitter, he was simply a man who fed others, and in a world ruled by hunger, for power, for purity, for divine favor that may have been the greatest sin of all. It began with a bowl, simple, humble, pottage, as the poor would call it. A mixture of oats and meat, thickened with ale and served hot in the cool shadow of Lent. It should have been nothing, just a midday meal in the kitchens of Lambeth. But history does not need swords to spill blood. Sometimes it only needs a spoon. The tale changes depending on who tells it. Some say Richard Roose poisoned the dish. Others claim the meat itself was the crime, that it was beef, forbidden by the holy calendar, that it was served on a Friday, the day Christ died, when flesh must be forsaken. And some whispered darker things still, that the cook had been set up, that the meat was placed by another's hand, and that the true poison was not in the pot, but in the politics. Whatever the truth, the outcome was certain. One guest fell ill, another convulsed. A third vomited blood into the folds of his velvet sleeves. Panic spread like grease fire. Clergy stumbled from the table, hands raised, not in blessing, but in fear. Somewhere in the confusion, the bowl was seized. The servants were questioned, and Richard was found silent, trembling, apron stained, his hands still warm from the flame. They say he stuttered, that he tried to explain, that he had tasted it himself and lived, that the meat had been stored by another, that no harm had been meant. Me. But in a world ruled by suspicion, innocence is not protection, it is provocation. What sin is greater, to break a fast or to break a ritual? For Henry VIII, the answer was clear. This was no longer about food, it was about order, control. He had just broken from Rome. England trembled in theological limbo. The people needed clarity. And nothing clarifies like punishment. Man had eaten meat on the day of Christ's death. Whether by mistake or malice mattered little. What mattered was that people saw the cost, and so Parliament moved with unnatural speed. The king summoned his will. The act was named. A bill of attainder no trial, no defense, just guilt by decree. Richard Roose would be boiled alive, not hanged, not beheaded. Boiled, the method was new. It's the message. Ancient Dant. Was this about faith or fear? Historians still debated. Was Richard an assassin, hoping to poison the archbishop and disrupt the fragile Reformation? Was he a pawn in a noble feud? Or was he just a cook, caught between two kingdoms, one of earth, one of heaven, both equally hungry? The truth may be lost, but the turning point remains. One bowl, one Friday. One decision made not by God, but by a man who thought himself God's equal in that moment. Richard Roose ceased to be a cook. He became a warning, a symbol, a scent. Something changed in the court after the ball. Not just in the air, though that too grew colder, more watchful. It was in the way men paused before they spoke, in the way the kitchens fell silent when the king's name passed through them like a gust of wind. England had broken from the Pope, but it had not broken free. It had only exchanged one God for another. Rome had given laws. Henry gave fear. The cook's crime was no longer just a sin. It had become a political scripture. The ink was still wet on the parchment when Parliament, without hesitation, passed a law that would echo like a scream through stone. Boiling, a punishment ancient in imagination, yet never before made legal in England, till now, until Henry needed fire to prove his holiness. What is a king without consequence? What is a throne without theater? To rule a fractured nation, Henry knew he needed more than swords and sermons. He needed symbols. Richard Roose became one, a servant, faceless, harmless, transformed into a public parable. The message was clear. No one is beyond reach, not even the one who prepares your supper. They dragged Richard through corridors that once smelled of cinnamon and cloves. Now they reeked of ink, sweat, and fear. The guards didn't look him in the eye. The priests didn't offer prayers. No confessor was sent. What would they confess? That mercy had died when England cut its ties from Rome. That power had no need of forgiveness. Outside, the fire was being prepared. Logs stacked high, iron filled with water. The cauldron hissed. As it heated, not with anger, but with purpose, like a mouth waiting to swallow. Inside the palace, no one dared speak the truth, that this was not justice, but performance. A new kind of doctrine, one that baptized with boiling. Richard's screams would not only serve the law, they would become the law. A sonic scripture to bind the people tighter than chains is this: holiness, whorehunger, dressed in robes. Henry, by now, was no longer the golden boy of England. His legs ached. His mood darkened with each passing year. His break from Rome had brought him a crown over the church, but also a mirror to his own soul. And when that mirror showed cracks, he turned to flame to purify, flame to silence, flame to remind every English subject that their faith was no longer theirs to interpret. And so a cook who had fed bishops, warmed the bones of the pious, stirred pots with reverent hands, was now condemned to be cooked himself. Not because he had challenged the king, but because he had revealed a truth far more dangerous, that even the smallest man, if left unpunished, might become a threat to a kingdom that rules by fear. So fear was served, not on plates, but in public. In England, whether it wept or cheered, learned to chew on silence. They brought him to Smithfield in the early light, when the fog still clung to the stones like a shroud. No bells rang, no prayers echoed, only the low murmur of a gathering crowd, curious, expectant, starving for something that tasted like justice. The iron cauldron stood waiting, its sides already weeping with heat, the water inside beginning to tremble. It looked like something from hell's own kitchen. And into it they would throw a man. Richard Roose was stripped of dignity before he was stripped of life, his clothes torn, his limbs bound, his name reduced to whispers and suspicion. A cook, who had once warmed the hands of priests, was now nothing more than a body to be softened and split. He was hoisted by ropes, trembling and pale, his mouth opening and closing with no words left to offer. What was there to say when the sentence was already boiling? The first touch of water scalded his feet. He screamed a sound that turned the morning birds quiet, but the ropes held. There would be no mercy, no plunge to end it quickly. He was lowered inch by inch, cut. Steam rose in sheets, veiling his agony like the curtains of a theater. His skin blistered and burst, the smell thick and nauseating. It was the smell of Sunday roast, twisted, familiar, and revolting. A reminder that flesh, no matter how sacred, is still flesh when it cooks. His legs thrashed, peeled, his torso submerged, his mouth foamed, eyes rolled skyward. The crowd winced, not in compassion, but in awe. A priest clutched his crucifix and turned away. A woman covered her child's eyes, but no one left, 'cause no one leaves a spectacle. And in this New England, pain was no longer hidden, it was law. He begged for death in the language of the body, jerks, spasms, the rattle of breath that could no longer rise fully. Some said he cried out names his mother, his God, his king. Others said his throat melted before words could form. Only one thing is agreed upon: he did not die quickly. The water rolled and rolled, roaring like a sermon, swallowing him slowly, until no part remained visible, just bubbles, then stillness, decay, and a silence that felt like blasphemy. What does it mean to cook a man for eating? What line must be crossed when the law decides that heat not rope, not blades, the truest path to order? And so Richard Roose died, not just in boiling water, but in boiling doctrine. His body became a broth of obedience, a reminder that even the lowliest among us can be used to feed the hunger of kings. He did not burn for a crown. He burned for a calendar, for eating meat on a Friday, after the steam cleared, after the fire hissed into wet ash and the scent of charred manhood clung to the hem of every robe in the square. The kingdom sat down to eat. They did not speak of it, They did not raise their goblets to the memory of the cook. No toasts were made, no grace was said, but still they ate, slowly, carefully, as if the act of chewing itself might summon ghosts. In Lambeth, the kitchens went quiet. The pots were clean, but untouched. The knives were sharpened, but no flesh was cut. Servants looked at their own hands and saw smoke curling from their knuckles. The echoes of his screaming lodged themselves between the cracks of the flagstones, between the ribs of every man who had ever held a spoon with certainty. His death had not ended at the cauldron. It had soaked into every plate in the kingdom. The archbishop, once fond of stews, now took only broth, thin, tasteless. He said it was for penance, but everyone knew it was fear. The same fear that made bishops fast, that made nobles spit out, lamb behind closed doors, that made the king push aside his platter and stare at the silver dish as if it might bleed. Henry VIII, bloated and breathless, sat at his own table that night. A feast had been prepared, venisons, sweetbreads, sugared quail, but the king touched none of it. He only stared. His fingers hovered over the rim of a goblet, unmoving. His appetite, once ravenous, had soured, because something had changed, not in his stomach. In his kingdom, he had meant to display control, to show that faith, once broken from Rome, would not be broken from discipline. But as the cook's flesh blistered in front of the crowd, something else blistered in England. Unease, doubt, the realization that if a man could be boiled for hunger, then no act was too small for death. A single servant whispered what no one dared say aloud. He died smelling like supper. Is this justice or indigestion of the soul? The kingdom feasted in silence. Every meal now tasted like something else. Not food, but punishment. Not nourishment, but warning. And as the table grew heavier with untouched meat, England learned that power does not always wear a crown or wield a sword. Sometimes it rises from a bowl. Sometimes it bubbles. Sometimes it screams. And sometimes it leaves the whole nation starving, not from lack, but from fear. When the body was gone, when the ashes cooled and the echoes faded, England passed a law, not to honor the dead, but to ensure more like him could follow. It was not enough to punish Richard Roose. He had to become a precedent, a policy, a path forward. The act for boiling was passed swiftly, with no debate, no resistance. Parliament did not hesitate. Fear greased the wheels. And from that day on, the law would remember what history tried to forget, that England, for a time, made boiling a legal sentence for the sin of poison and for the sin of disobedience. They carved it into statute, as if permanence could justify horror, that men might one day look back and say, it was the law, instead of asking, was it right? That future cooks, future servants, future strangers might know that even silence could not save them, that the fire was watching, that heat could be holy. But laws are not just words, they are rituals. And this one demanded flesh. Others would die this way in scalding oil, in vats prepared not for meals, but for messages. The punishment spread like a fever, carried on whispers through kitchens, through taverns, through the minds of men who had once believed that crime had to be grand to be deadly. No more. Now it was enough to cook at the wrong hour, to feed the wrong man, to be accused by the wrong lips. And if the king willed it, the fire would receive you. What does it mean when the law is born from a scream? Roose was never given a grave, no monument, no stone, only a memory sealed in law, as though his agony could be made clean by parchment. The very tool that erased his right to trial became the monument to his pain. A line in a legal code, inked in fear, and yet there were some who remembered. Old cooks whispered his name like a prayer before lighting their stoves. Mothers warned their sons not to speak when the king's meals were served. And in the city's underbelly, where power did not reach, they told the story differently. Not of a man who poisoned, but of a man who was sacrificed, offered up, not for guilt, but for example. Henry VIII would go on to marry to war, to reshape. England's soul, that buried beneath the crowns and treaties, was a cook, not noble, not sainted, just burned, gone, and written beside his absence, a law that boiled a man so that others would learn to simmer. He left behind no heir, no legend, no portrait in gilded frame, only steam, only the memory of bubbling skin, only the scent of something no nation should ever grow used to, the smell of a man cooked alive under royal order. Richard Roose was not a traitor nor a prophet. He was not even a rebel. He was a servant, a cook, a man of flame and broth. And yet, in death, he became something far more dangerous, a mirror for what is more unsettling to a king than the reminder that control must be performed over and over. Louder each time, more grotesque with each display lest it fade. Fear must be fed regularly, like a fire, or it dies cold. Scous's legacy is not in history books. It is in the absence of questions, in the silence that followed, in the way no bishop dared protest. No noble wrote his name in the margins. He became a symbol, not of justice, but of what justice looks like when twisted by anxiety and cloaked in righteousness. Not a martyr, not even a warning, but a signal that power had turned inward, that Henry's crown no longer rested upon his head pressed into his skull. In churches, they still preached fasting on Fridays, but no one forgot the taste of fear that now accompanied their hunger. Every empty plate became a quiet compliance, not just to God, but to the man who had claimed God's authority for himself. Was it divine justice that boiled the cook, or was it the crown's fear of losing control? Symbols rot, too, in time, but Roose's death never decomposed, hung, suspended in the steam of England's memory. It's quietly altering how people viewed their monarch, not as a father, but as a furnace, a man who would turn heat into law, fire into doctrine, a man who would rather burn a body than let the illusion of sin go unpunished. And yet, in that boiling cauldron, something else was destroyed. Not just a man, but the last thread of dignity that tied the king to his people. For after that day, even those who loved Henry flinched when the fire was lit. He had proven his strength, but revealed his terror. He had silenced doubt, but exposed the hollowness of his faith. The cook's death was not an outburst. It was a philosophy, that fear maintains order, that punishment must be theatrical, that bodies are tools and suffering persuasive. In that sense, Richard Roose became more than a cook. He became a theology of pain, a burnt offering not to heaven, but to the idea of monarchy itself. And England, it learned that crowns are not light, that power grows heavy when worn without mercy, that when rulers feed on fear, even bread begins to taste like Ashdod. And still the question simmers, did Roose die for a crime, or for the convenience of being edible? When the fire cooled and the crowd dispersed, there was no procession, no cloth-wrapped bodies, no solemn march to a churchyard grave. The remnants of Richard Roose whatever had not melted, not evaporated, not been washed into the gutters of Smithfield, were discarded like refuse. They say his bones were swept into buckets alongside the ash, thrown into the Thames with the kitchen waste, swallowed by the city that had once eaten his food and now digested his death. There is no tombstone, no parish register, no year etched in brass. He exists in no family tree, only in footnotes, in hushed academic margins, in the burnt edges of parchment. History did not remember him. It erased him, not violently, but efficiently. And perhaps that is the crueler fate, not to be mourned or reviled, but to be removed. For what is more terrifying than a kingdom that kills and forgets? His name became a risk. Servants refused to speak it aloud, fearing guilt by association. Clergymen who once accepted his meals now baptized silence. Even his accusers did not boast. It was as if the kingdom conspired to scrub him from its conscience, and yet he lingered in ghost stories, in warnings passed from mother to child, in kitchens where steam hissed too loudly, where pots bubbled with uneasy rhythm. They say his spirit wandered, not for vengeance, but for memory. A man who died screaming does not demand justice. He demands to be remembered. But England, newly Protestant, newly afraid, had no space for inconvenient ghosts. It paved over him with law. It salted his memory with shame, carefully. The man became myth, not the kind that inspires, kind that haunts. What becomes of a country that throws its dead into silence? Kai. And what becomes of a man who is only remembered by the smell of his burning? Perhaps this is the true punishment, not the boiling, but the forgetting. No songs, no requiem, no trace. Only a name that slips through fingers like broth gone cold. Only a scream that once tore through London and now cannot be heard at all. It was not Henry's blade that first condemned Richard Roose. It was the calendar, quiet line on a sacred chart. Friday, no meat. A rule whispered from pulpits, etched into the rhythm of Christian life for centuries. To eat flesh on the day of Christ's suffering was to mock the passion, to spit on the cross, to feast while heaven wept. This was not merely sin, it was sacrilege. And sacrilege, when mixed with fire and fear, becomes execution. The church, even as it fractured, still ruled the body. It told you when to kneel, when to fast, when to hold your tongue, and when to open your mouth, but never to chew on flesh when Christ had bled. Hunger was holy. To suffer emptiness was to echo Golgotha. But in a world where doctrine fed kings, even fasting could be weaponized. The irony was sharp enough to draw. Blood, the same faith that preached mercy, sent a cook to boil. The same priest who offered bread as Christ's body now burned a man for cooking a different one. Was it meat that killed him more, meaning twisted into threat? When the church lost Rome, it scrambled for power, and Richard was power-soft, unarmed, symbolically rich. The priesthood did not wield swords, but they knew the weight of influence. It was their doctrine that had shaped England's moral spine. It was their silence that now bent it toward fire. No bishop stood before the inn cauldron that day. No monk threw himself between king and victim. They watched or turned away, or prayed quietly for their own safety, knowing that one wrong word could place them in the pot next. And so the faith of a nation began to rot, not from disbelief, but from fear. Fasting turned from devotion to duty. Abstinence no longer meant love of Christ, but obedience to the crown. The sacred had been eaten alive by policy. Did God mourn that day? Or did he stay silent too? In cathedrals, the smell of incense could no longer mask the memory of steam. Confessionals echoed with guilt that had less to do with sin and more to do with survival. The church, once a haven, had become a witness to cruelty, dressed in robes and crowned with complicity. They said Richard fed meat 2 men on a Friday, but what he truly fed them was proof that fear had replaced faith, that ritual had devoured love, that even a meal, if served on the wrong day, could lead to hell here on earth, and no amount of prayer could boil that clean. It was not enough to kill him. He had to be seen dying. The punishment meant nothing in darkness. The heat, the screams, the slow bubbling of flesh, all of it had to be witnessed. Public, performative, perfect. In Tudor England, pain was not hidden, it was paraded. Pain was proof of power, of control, of divine favor wrapped in steel and smoke. Richard Roose's execution was not justice, it was theater. In England was the audience. They came by the hundreds, pressing against one another in the square, their breath fogging in the morning cold, their eyes gleaming with something they could not name. Not joy, not cruelty, but a need to see. To see that sin had a shape, that disobedience could be touched, smelled, heard. That punishment was not abstracted, had steam and shrieks and bones that snapped when boiled too long. Children were lifted onto shoulders. Vendors sold spiced nuts. A woman fainted. Priest whispered psalms that no one listened to. And in the center, a man dissolved. What lesson is taught by a man's skin slipping from his bones? The message was clear. Order would not come by decree alone. It would come by fear, sealed not with ink, but with agony. If a cook could be turned to soup, what might happen to a nobleman who strayed, to a bishop who hesitated, to a subject who dared to ask why? This was morality written in fire, not to guide, but to bind. The memory of Richard's death would outlive him, not in compassion, but in calculation. Other executions followed, burnings, hangings, the rack, the saw, but none struck the same chord as boiling, 'cause boiling was intimate. It was not a single blow, not a clean drop from the gallows. It was a process, a ritual, a slow unmaking of the body that mirrored the slow unraveling of the soul. Tudor England became a landscape of visible warnings. Gallows at crossroads, spikes on bridges, heads rotting above gates, but none of them screamed quite like the pot. None of them turned a man's breath into bubbles. And the people, they learned to walk straighter, to eat more quietly, to observe Fridays, not with reverence, but with restraint. It feared not God's wrath, but the king's appetite for spectacle, for flame. Did it purify the kingdom or poison it forever? 'Cause once pain becomes a performance, it never truly ends. It echoes in dreams, in kitchens, in the silence between bites of bread. And even long after the cauldron cooled, the steam still hung in the minds of those who watched and those who wondered if they might be next. It always returns to the fire, not the flame that cooks, but the one that condemns, the one that rises not from wood, but from fear. They called it justice. They called it divine order. They said the man ate meat on a Friday, and so the water must boil. But beneath all the laws, beneath the robes and crowns in scripture, there was something simpler, uglier, something no one dared name. Control, hunger, not just for food, but for dominance. And Richard Roose, cook, servant, man of warmth, became the offering. They did not just kill him, they cooked him, slowly, publicly, ritualistically. They made his body into a sermon, his screams into liturgy, his death into a meal that England would chew on for generations. The fire was the altar, the water, the wine, and his flesh the communion. But what if it was all a mistake? What if he didn't poison the dish? What if the meat was a misjudgment? What if the archbishop's illness came from rot, not heresy? Then what did they burn? A man, or a moment of doubt wrapped in skin? In killing Richard, they made him unforgettable, but not in stone or hymn or legend, in smell, in heat, in the stain he left on the nation's conscience. His campaign and became a story that children weren't meant to hear but did. Fear that crept into every Friday meal, a shadow that flickered in every kitchen flame. And still the question boils, was it worth it? Was the kingdom stronger for it? Was faith renewed? Did England feel holier with a man's fat floating on the surface of justice? Died that day. Something colder, quieter, trust, mercy, the idea that law could still make space for humanity. Because once you've seen a man boiled for eating, you never look at hunger the same way. Richard Roose is gone. No bones, no grave, only the memory of heat. Only the whisper that if a meal could kill a man, then no one is safe not from their appetite, and not from their king. So next time the meat sizzles and the room fills with warmth, ask yourself, is this comfort or a warning served hot? Because in England, once upon a time, one man's supper became his sentence. Hence, the kingdom never hungered the same again.